Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Beg to Differ's special series, where we have fun and meaningful conversations with filmmakers, creatives, and executives to hear their views and perspectives on Asian American representation in Hollywood and their advice for college students trying to break into the industry. Today, we are extremely honored to be joined by a very, very special guest, Mr. Jack Pan. Jack is a renowned head of marketing for film. He worked on many of your favorite movies, including the Pirates of the Caribbean series, The Incredibles, Now You See Me, and the Twilight saga. He was also the president of motion picture marketing at STX Entertainment and the president of worldwide marketing at Global Road Entertainment. Jack, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Harry.
Yes. So one thing that I've noticed throughout the year, which makes me personally really, really excited, is to see that Asian American representation is really growing in Hollywood. So this year we have 3 Asian-led blockbusters, including Mortal Kombat, Snake Eyes, and Shang-Chi. We also see Asian filmmakers and actors winning prestigious awards like Chloe Zhao and Steven Yeun. So as a prominent Hollywood executive, what are some of the changes you are seeing in the industry? And what are studios and production companies currently doing to increase Asian representation in their films and shows?
That's a fantastic question, and your observation is spot on. There is certainly an exponentially increased awareness in terms of representation, both on screen and, of course, behind screen and the craftsmanship throughout the entire development to production to distribution process. And I would say that there is much more of a willingness for executives and management at all levels to really try and foster an environment where the storytelling can be more diverse and where traditionally or historically underrepresented groups of people, not necessarily defined just by race, get a chance to bring their storytelling to the decision makers, right? The gatekeepers, because I think in the past, many decisions are really made based on purely economic terms, and the economic terms are all based on assumptions of what a commercial property could achieve. Yet at the same time, there is more of a willingness to reevaluate what kind of economics makes sense for different groups who want to bring stories to very specific audiences. So that would be the primary change that you're seeing happening, in the trenches at the corporate level. And then of course, on the artistic front, I think that there has been just an overall, because of globalization, there has been an overall appetite among people of all races, including of course Asians and Asian Americans, filmmakers of Asian descent, to really want to take ownership of how they're portrayed on screen.
That makes so much sense. And it's so nice to see that globalization has really increased the outreach that movies can have and really increased the connectivity between people from different cultures and countries. So that kind of leads into my next question. So in my internship, one of the really interesting things that we're asked to do is to evaluate the marketability of the projects that we read. So I know that there's a lot of globalization, especially growing markets like China and India. So does the increasing representation when in the development stage add new standards to what studios look for when they decide whether to greenlight a project or not? And from a filmmaker perspective, how do they decide which types of projects can best increase representation and which ones they need to avoid?
Sure. Well, there are probably several ways to unpack that question. I would say that there is, when we take a sort of upside down funnel approach and start with sort of the broadest, widest releases, the broadest targeting, widest releases that are on paper architected to become, let's say, worldwide blockbusters or franchises. At that level, I believe that the primary concern right now from an executive standpoint is just increasing the ensemble representation. And yet at the same time, there are individual cases that you can see certainly taken by the MCU, for example, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they really want to go deeper into the storytelling of a particularly underrepresented group of people, whether it's Black Panther or the upcoming Shang-Chi. And so that's fantastic to see, because then that allows for a much deeper and really also wider sort of tapestry of, of artists who can touch the project, not just from, being in an ensemble role, but everything from, right, the entire crew of the production to even the development executives that are brought on board, to the marketing consultants who are then helping to sort of reach out to those targeted groups. And then if you sort of go down the funnel into more mid-range or more independent films, I think there is obviously much more of a concentration on telling very personal and specific stories to culture, that are not intended to become necessarily global blockbusters, but are rather meant, right, to work on a level of really just personal connection to characters and situations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're exclusively designed for an audience that is of the same ethnicity, but rather, right, people who may have similar shared or lived experiences. But certainly they're aiming to be a much more personal and of course, right, character-driven story that is meant to appeal in a very different way, and probably find its audience over time, as opposed to immediately, right, on opening weekend to an audience that's seeking more just pure entertainment. So I think that there are several different ways that representation is coming about, and it really just depends on the intent, right, of the filmmaking team, or really of the business executives that are ultimately helpful in terms of giving minorities more of a chance to contribute to any of the sort of roles that might be involved in the process.
That makes so much sense. And I love that Hollywood studios and executives are looking for ways to include more filmmakers in the whole progress and include more of them in the conversation. And kind of zooming out into, I guess, the international market, we kind of briefly touched on that. I know that you have worked a lot on building bridges between US and Asian markets like China. So a lot of Hollywood executives, as well as filmmakers, are asking the question, what is the key to building that bridge between different countries? What is the key to deciding what topics, what kind of films can appeal to drastically different groups of audiences? And so where do you kind of see that from your experiences? And where do you see US, China, or US and any other foreign country relations in film going in the future?
That's a terrific question. I would say that while there are always going to be local differences in terms of what audiences in other countries might specifically desire, or what might appeal more to certain territories of the world, ultimately, as the world has become more really connected through a lot of it through entertainment culture exported by Hollywood initially, the universal stories really tend to work well across the board. And those are really, I would say, just stories or themes that really transcend class or race or geography, right? And yet at the same time, there is, of course, a desire to want to have very specific elements that might work in as many places as possible. So you'll see that probably done maybe very overtly in some of the main blockbusters, whether it's Godzilla versus Kong, right, or some of the Transformers or Fast and Furious series, where there is much more of a diverse ensemble cast, so that you can hopefully have at least one of the main crew appeal to a certain region of the world. And then there are certain, I would say, elements, whether it's action that is dialed up or whether it's really a lot of times it's background settings taking place in certain parts of the world that can appeal very specifically to a certain audience, whether it's China or whether it's Europe and or emerging markets. And at the same time, they are complementary or secondary rather, right, to the idea of a main story. And the story could be the people across the world coming together, right, to fight, to defend Earth from giant competing monsters, or even going back as far as the movie Independence Day in 1996, was really when you started to see how casting could become very diverse in big blockbusters to try and appeal to an increasingly global audience, and where you would see set pieces, right, take place in filmed in lots of different parts of the world. That's traditionally been the sort of the low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, there are much more, I would say, story-specific tweaks and considerations that can be made to appeal to the audiences that are certainly to, I would say, markets that are the fastest growing in terms of their appetite for content, whether it's South Korea, Taiwan, and some in the last 10 years, countries such as Brazil and Mexico and Russia. Certain genres have tended to work better for markets that have just been emerging. And once a market starts to stabilize and the people in that territory become much more familiar with film and they've seen more movies, there's a maturity, and sometimes the general taste will start to shift a little bit, and there'll be more of a hunger for movies that are maybe a little bit genres that are a little bit more sophisticated and not necessarily as genre defined. And so you'll definitely see an evolution in terms of how, and that will continue also to shift, you know, as these emerging markets become more mature. So I would say that there are different tactics that are taken to, you know, to appeal to certainly the world at large versus markets that are sort of up and coming. And then a lot of it, of course, is going to be in the way that the movies are marketed. So there are going to be tweaks that are made to the materials to really try and localize the appeal of a Hollywood production. And you'll see very stark differences in terms of the material that's shown in parts of Asia, for example, versus what you'll see in the Western world, right? And that's done to localize the appeal of the same story that would otherwise be, right, consumed by the audience, regardless of where they are geographically.
Yeah, and I know that you are working as a consultant who has helped a lot of filmmakers and studios really successfully market their movies out. And I know that we talked a lot about how marketing requires a lot of the producer mindset to look at elements in a movie which ones to promote. And now I completely agree with what you said, that success cannot be measured just by box office anymore, but it's also like, you know, representation, what kind of messages a movie tries to send. So when you're looking at a movie, what are some of the big things that you look at when you're thinking about the marketability, about like the viability of this movie, especially towards a global audience now?
Great question. So much of, I believe, what really makes movies, especially today, really resonate are questions of what the movie is, what the intent of the movie is, and what is it trying to say? What is the soul of the film, and how will it be remembered? Not just not how it will just not only how it'll be welcomed at release, but how will it be remembered and how will it last the test of time, right? And will it have something very unique and something very memorable to say about the culture of its time? And so looking for voices that are very singular and that can bring a very distinct point of view and do it in a very articulate way through, of course, right, expression of well-developed characters that people can relate to, going through different circumstances in life where those themes can be identified. I would say that in terms of looking at what's marketable, you definitely want to have, the foundations, of course, right, are always going to be character and story, and whether or not you can root for the protagonists, and whether or not that protagonist's mission or what what circumstances the mission the characters find themselves in are relatable enough. And outside of that, what you're really looking for is what is the right, like what is the overall message that you can relate from this particular movie, when you're going to be tasked for describing why it's worth spending your time, right, and your money to go see. And so that can be done, of course, through, and really it's going to be a culmination of the way that it's shot, and the many different visual elements and or audio elements that you can take from the film. uh, how well does it transport you viscerally into a world, right, that whether it's a world that you've never seen before, or whether it's a world that's very highly relatable and intimate, and how are you going to marry that with how you're going to express what it is the character is trying to achieve, right? So you're always really looking at, from a marketing perspective, taking both the intimate and sort of the macro scope and blending it into hopefully something that is unique and that has a point of view, right? And more so, I would say, than not, of course, Hollywood has gravitated towards large blockbuster franchises because they have built-in awareness and they have predefined audiences who have liked what those movies have brought in the past. But the bar is high for each subsequent installment, and you have to bring something that is slightly new, yet at the same time keep what's familiar that people have liked. And what's increasingly harder is bringing movies that are, quote, in the middle, right, to audiences at enough scale, right, to worth the costs and the risks that are borne by the financiers. And there's a lot of, I would say, debate as to the viability of those theatrically versus streaming, where the numbers are not as important to defining the success of those movies. But even when you look at theatrical, I really believe that, again, when it comes to representation, there's been many examples recently of movies that were in the mid-range that didn't have a lot of historical precedent, that have worked really well commercially as well as artistically, because they have spoken very truthfully to the shared experience of a certain group, whether it's movies like Hidden Figures or Crazy Rich Asians, right? Like those movies that have really been able to have great production value, have a voice, right, of characters that are very relatable, but at the same time you haven't seen often represented, depicted, and right, in storylines that really are inspirational and give people a lot of, I would say, uh, curiosity, right, to sort of learn about maybe cultures that they haven't been exposed to as much, right, in a way that doesn't feel, of course, like it's going to be necessarily a hard view, but rather something where, right, they can they can come out of the movie and feel good about themselves, right? So I think that there's lots of ways that movies can be packaged, and it's really based on the vision, of course, right, of the filmmaker, but the role of marketing is to really help make the filmmakers aware of what audiences are looking for, what they would respond to, and ways that their their message could be sort of packaged, when it comes down to short form materials.
Wow, that is such deep and amazing insight into the industry. I'm sure that our audiences and students have learned so much and they're very excited about their filmmaking careers. So speaking of students, we of course have an entire generation of filmmakers, emerging filmmakers at Duke who are really, really amazing and vibrant. We actually just had our most recent DIFF festival over Zoom last Friday, and we saw a lot of really, really amazing films. And one common theme that we've been seeing is that students really try to have diverse storytelling and try to be part of the progress of increasing diversity. So as a really successful film executive, what would be some of your advice for students who are trying to break into Hollywood? And what would you say to students from groups that are traditionally underrepresented in Hollywood? And most importantly, what can they do now in a college setting to be really part of the progress through their own filmmaking and activities right now?
Wow. Well, I think it's phenomenal to hear that there has been such excitement and such participation, right, in the Duke International Film Festival that you started. That's very encouraging to see. My advice would be to really take storytelling ownership into your own hands, because really at the end of the day, it's one of the most democratic ways of being able to express yourself, your experiences, and to be able to move other people, and to be able to share what it's like to have your point of view with somebody who might have a completely different upbringing. And so I would say it's super important that you feel encouraged to tell your own story. And when you look back at history, you can see that so much of culture, so much of whether it's stereotypes or whether it's just perceptions, right, are shaped by the people who create the art, whether it's writing or whether it's a visual medium. The the way that people are depicted and how that's passed on to generations of youth and then subsequently adults is super important in terms of bringing understanding, right, and empathy to the world. So it's really important that you feel empowered to do that, and that there's opportunity for you in Hollywood as well as in other parts of the world, that right, there are many different and increasingly so production hubs, filmmaking hubs around the world. And it's, I would say, really heartening to see that there is an interest in that. And I would say just be hopeful that there is a rising generation of executives in Hollywood, and I think probably in other hubs around the world, that are very mindful of properly giving everyone a chance to tell their stories, and more so now than ever before. So as long as you bring the stories, then just believe that there will be people on the other end who will want to listen to them and help you bring them to a larger audience.
I am so inspired by that. I almost want to just pick up a camera and go make a film right now. And I hope that our viewers feel exactly the same way. And Jack, just thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you everyone for tuning into another special episode of I Beg to Differ. I hope you've learned a lot. And Jack has given us a lot of time and a lot of really, really great insight that I really, really hope can help our viewers. You can support our channel by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to our channel. You can also like our Facebook and Instagram pages to learn more and become part of DIFF. We'll see you next time in another episode of I Beg to Differ.